Okay, let's set the stage. It's Arizona, 1893. But this is not the Grand Canyon Tourism Board version of Arizona. This is frontier Arizona, dry, isolated, the kind of place where if you hear a scream, you don't ask questions. Then one morning you walk outside and find the goat pen empty, the gates still shut, but the fence flattened like paper. And the ground covered in weird tracks, big tracks. Hooved, but not like any horse you've seen. They're wider, longer, spaced impossibly far apart, like something had leapt instead of walked. Something had charged through here. Something big. And judging by what it did to the fence and the shredded remains of a metal feed bucket, it wasn't exactly gentle. You follow the trail until it fades into the desert, but not before you see something impossible. A silhouette on the ridge. Tall, lanky, covered in reddish dust. And as it turns to face you, you swear it has something tied to its back. Something human-shaped. And then it vanishes into the heat shimmer. If this were just a hallucination, we could all move on. Blame the sunstroke. Or bad moonshine. But this was just one of many encounters. And most people didn't live long enough to get a second look. Let's rewind. A few years earlier, around 1883, some prospectors were camping near Eagle Creek. Just 3 dusty men trying to strike silver and avoid dysentery. In the middle of the night, they were jolted awake by something crashing through the edge of their camp. It wasn't walking, it was stampeding. One of them jumped up with a rifle, caught a half-second glimpse of the creature, and immediately said, "That's not a horse." Why? Because it was too big, the legs were too long, the back was too arched. And worst of all, there was something flapping against its sides. Leather straps, long ones, and what looked horrifyingly like ribs. Human ribs. They watched it vanish into the dust like a nightmare they'd accidentally disturbed. The next morning, they found prints in the dirt. Not paw prints, not hooves. Something in between. One man said they looked like camel tracks. The others laughed. Camels? In Arizona? But then it happened again, and this time it was worse. A woman, the wife of a homesteader near Eagle River, heard a strange groaning sound one night. She stepped outside to investigate. Her husband found her the next morning. Trampled. No claw marks, no bites. Just crushed. Near her body were those same hoof prints. Giant. Too large for horses. Too widely spaced for mules. And there were drag marks in the dirt. Like something heavy. Something. Not her. Had been pulled through the same spot. No known predator did that kind of damage. No bandit would leave her untouched and simply vanish. The locals began whispering. The miners followed. Then the ranchers. And soon everyone was on edge. They were all seeing something strange. A massive beast. Red. Wild. Dragging something behind it. Or worse, wearing it. They started calling it the Red Ghost. Because that's what it looked like. A crimson blur moving silently across the desert. Fast and untouchable. Some said it had glowing eyes. Others said it left behind the smell of death. A few claimed it didn't even attack. It just stood and stared, as if waiting for something. But the most terrifying part wasn't how it moved or what it looked like. It was what it carried. Multiple people described human remains, not a live rider, not a corpse slumped in a saddle. Bones tied on like cargo, a skull bouncing against red fur, an arm bone swinging like a lantern. And every person described the same creature, too big to be a horse, too long-legged for a mule. No one had seen anything like it, except someone had. Someone knew exactly what it was. They just hadn't told anyone yet. But we'll get to that, because what this thing actually was is somehow more bizarre than the legend. It wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a demon. It was real. It was alive. And it was the government's fault. Let's talk about how. The US military is directly responsible for an undead camel haunting the American Southwest. Because that creature tearing up melon patches and traumatizing miners, it wasn't supernatural. It was just an abandoned government project. To understand that, we have to go back to the mid-1850s. At the time, America was expanding west. Fast, but the terrain was brutal. Mountains, canyons, deserts with no water, and no roads. And we were trying to build forts, move supplies, and civilize the frontier using wagons, horses, and mules that were dying left and right. Enter a bold idea. The Secretary of War at the time, a man named Jefferson Davis, yes, the future Confederate president, read about how camels were used in the Middle East. Long-distance caravans, desert heat, minimal water, maximum load capacity. He said, "Hold up. What if we use camels?" And Congress for once said, "Sure. Why not?" They funded the United States Camel Corps in 1855. It became a thing, a real operation. Navy ships were sent to Egypt and Tunisia. The military hired local camel wranglers, including a man named Haji Ali, who became known as High Jolly because Americans couldn't pronounce his real name. In 1856, a Navy transport ship pulled into Texas carrying 33 camels. This is not a joke. The US military imported camels like exotic livestock, unloaded them onto Texas soil, and basically said, "All right, let's conquer the desert." And to everyone's surprise, the camels thrived. They could carry up to 600 pounds. They didn't need water for days. They were fast, tough. Basically, the tanks of the animal kingdom. Reports came in of camels outperforming mules in test runs between remote outposts. They even helped deliver mail in hard-to-reach areas. But there was a catch. Nobody liked them. The soldiers complained that the camels were mean. They bit. They kicked. They made horrible groaning noises at night. They smelled like old socks soaked in vinegar. And worst of all, horses freaked out around them. Total panic. Stampedes, injuries, chaos. Morale took a dive. And then the Civil War hit. Jefferson Davis, the man who started the Camel Corps, became president of the Confederacy, which made continuing his pet project awkward. By 1864, the Camel Corps was quietly abandoned. Some camels were sold off. Others were just released into the wild. No plan, no follow-up. Just, good luck out there, desert camel. Hope you thrive. And surprisingly, they did. Arizona, New Mexico, West Texas. Turns out those places feel kind of like North Africa if you squint and ignore the cacti. Over the next few decades, wild camel sightings popped up in local newspapers. Most people thought they were hoaxes, but the people who actually saw them said otherwise. And that brings us back to the 1880s. Because somewhere out there, one of those camels, maybe one trained at Camp Verde, maybe one born in the wild, ended up tangled in an old military harness. And attached to that harness, bones. Now here's where it gets murky. Was the skeleton tied to it during a training accident? Was it an escaped rider who died and decomposed in the saddle? Was someone punished, executed even, by being lashed to the beast and sent off into the desert? No one knows. But this is how legends are born. A real animal, a real corpse, a haunting image repeated again and again by terrified witnesses across the American Southwest. And if you were a miner or rancher in 1885 and saw that thing stomping across the desert, would you think, oh, that's from a discontinued military logistics program from 30 years ago? Number, you'd think, hell has opened and it's riding a camel. And the wildest part, it worked. The fear worked. Even people who had never seen the red ghost believed in it. They locked their doors. They made up rules. Don't ride at night. Don't travel alone. If you see something on the ridge, don't stare at it. Don't follow the hoof prints. Don't speak its name. Whispers became warnings. Warnings became stories. And stories became history. Just not the kind they teach in school. But while the red ghost legend grew, so did the sightings. And some of those encounters were so specific, so disturbing, that they're worth looking at in detail. Because this wasn't just rumour. These were real accounts. People with names, locations. Some even staked their reputations, and in a few cases, their sanity, on what they saw. Let's start with the Eagle Creek Miners, 1883. We mentioned them earlier, 3 prospectors camping out in the wilderness. Their campfires still smouldering when, in the middle of the night, something massive charges through their perimeter. It doesn't attack, doesn't growl, just runs, but 2 of them catch a glimpse. And what they describe is the same. A red-furred beast nearly 10 feet tall, with leather straps flapping against its sides. And bones. They swear a human skeleton was tied to its back. Not slumped, strapped, stiff, bouncing like a scarecrow under the moonlight. The next morning, all that's left are tracks. Deep, long, rounded, camel-like. Then there's the trampled woman. A rancher near the Salt River hears a wailing sound late at night. His wife steps outside to investigate. She never returns. By morning, he finds her body. Crushed. No signs of an animal attack. No claw marks, no weapons. Just blunt force trauma, consistent with being stomped. And around her are hoof prints, but they're massive, far too large for horses, too widely spaced for any known mule or ox. And there's something else, drag marks. As if something heavy, not human, had passed through the same spot just before. Locals blamed the red ghost, so did the newspapers. Next came the miners in the Mazatzal Mountains. A group of them is hiking back from a dig site at dusk. They're walking a narrow trail above a gully when they spot it. Down below, grazing on scrub brush. It doesn't look right. Too big. Too red. The way it chews is off. One man raises his rifle and fires a warning shot. The creature looks up. It stares directly at them. Its eyes are dark, expressionless, like black marbles. It doesn't run, doesn't flinch, just starts walking toward them, slow and deliberate. They drop everything and run. The man who later told the story swore he could hear metal, buckles or harness rings, clinking with each step. He didn't sleep for 3 days. Then there were the stagecoach travellers, 1885. This account comes from a passenger named Mrs. Hall. She was heading west toward California. The stagecoach had broken down in the desert, so they stopped for the night. Around midnight, the driver spots movement on the ridge and wakes everyone up. They all watch as a massive figure, too tall for a horse, too bulky for a deer, lumbers up the hill. Its body sways almost like it's limping. The driver whispers, "It's that damn ghost camel." Mrs. Hall thinks he's joking until she sees it. She later writes in her journal, "The beast was dragging bones behind it. The face was hollow. It had death tied to its back." Imagine writing that in your diary and then trying to fall asleep. Then there's the rancher who tried to shoot it. He sees the red ghost near his cattle trough one evening. It's drinking. He's had enough. He grabs his Winchester, takes aim, and fires. The shot lands, square in the ribs, but the creature doesn't react. It turns its head, looks right at him, doesn't run, doesn't charge, just stares. Then it walks away, slowly, calmly, as if it knows no one can stop it. Later, the rancher finds blood where it had stood, but the trail disappears within half a mile. He never saw it again. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, okay, people thought they saw something. But isn't this just mass hysteria? A collective hallucination? The desert playing tricks? Maybe. But here's the thing. These people didn't all know each other. They weren't in the same towns. They weren't drinking the same water or reading the same rumours. And their stories? They're eerily consistent. Red fur, massive size, human bones strapped to the back, old military harnesses, no sound, or strange groaning, no fear of humans. That's not folklore, that's data. Dozens of witnesses, spread over years, describing the same thing, down to the bones. And here's what made them all so afraid. It wasn't just the camel. It was the idea that something had died and kept walking. So let's ask the question everyone's been screaming into their campfires since 1883. Why was there a human skeleton tied to a camel? Because you know what's weirder than a rogue camel charging around Arizona? A rogue camel charging around Arizona, with someone's bones still strapped to it. And here's the kicker. Nobody has ever figured out whose bones they were, how they got there, or why they stayed there for years. So let's break down the theories. And fair warning, they range from tragic accident to full-blown military horror story. Theory 1, training gone horribly wrong. This is the most logical version, the least creepy if that's possible. Picture it. One of the Camel Corps soldiers, maybe an explorer, maybe a scout, goes out for a solo ride to test a camel. Somewhere along the route, he falls, but instead of slipping free, he gets caught in the harness. The camel doesn't stop. It keeps walking. Maybe for hours, maybe for days. And in that kind of heat, that kind of terrain, it wouldn't take long for the body to dry out, desiccate, and become, well, a skeleton. If no one came looking, if no one found him in time, the result would be exactly what people described. A camel wandering alone, confused, carrying a corpse. It's grim, but it's entirely possible. Theory 2. Frontier justice. Now let's get darker. Some believe this wasn't an accident. It was a punishment. Or an execution. Imagine the 1850s. You're out in the middle of nowhere. No courts, no jails, no sheriff. Someone commits a crime. Theft. Assault. Desertion. Maybe something worse. And instead of dealing with a trial, the soldiers decide to make an example. They tie him to a camel. No food. No water. And they send the animal into the desert. Let the land take him, they say. And it does. Slowly. The camel survives. The man doesn't. And what's left, bones tied into the gear, becomes nightmare fuel for generations. That's not justice. That's folklore in the making. Theory 3. Something superstitious. This is where things take a ritual turn. Some say this was a curse, a deliberate act of vengeance, that someone tied a body to the beast, not out of punishment, but out of hatred. Maybe it was native retaliation. Maybe settlers trying to invoke fear. Maybe soldiers trying to spook local populations. The goal? To create a monster, a restless spirit, a creature that carries the soul of a wrongdoer into the wild forever. It sounds far-fetched, until you remember that fear is a powerful tool, and stories like this scared people straight out of settlements. Intentional or not, the result was the same. Theory 4. There was never a skeleton, until there was. This one's subtle. It suggests the skeleton didn't appear right away. At first it was just a camel. A wild one, still wearing old gear. Maybe saddle straps. Maybe ropes. A forgotten military relic. But then the story started. People saw something, got scared, described bones. Maybe what they saw was torn canvas, dried out leather, or a tangle of brush clinging to the beast's flank. But fear does strange things to memory. And then, one day, bones did get tangled in the harness. Maybe they were animal bones, maybe human, maybe scavenged from somewhere else. But after that moment, no one could unsee it. The skeleton was real now. The red ghost wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. And when that final camel was killed, and bones were found strapped to its back, it cemented the legend. Retroactive proof. Truth built backward from myth. So, which one's real? Here's the truth. We don't know, and we probably never will. There's no report, no name, and no badge number, no gravestone. The bones were buried or scavenged, or forgotten. The gear rotted. The newspapers moved on. And all we're left with is the story. But it's a powerful one, because it taps into every fear the frontier couldn't escape. Isolation, death, unnatural beasts, and the idea that something could die, but keep walking. That's what haunted people. The desert was already strange, empty, endless, quiet. But now they had a reason to look over their shoulders at sunset, a reason to listen for hooves on dry gravel, a reason to lock the door, because somewhere out there was a camel, and it wasn't alone. All right, let's fast forward to 1893. 10 years of whispers, dozens of sightings, dead livestock, terrified settlers, and one giant, unkillable camel ghosting through the desert, like it paid no taxes and feared no man. And then, it shows up, in someone's melon patch. That's how the legend ends, not with a cavalry showdown or a dramatic ambush, but with a farmer trying to protect his crops. Enter Mizu Hastings. Now, Mizu wasn't a gunslinger. He wasn't a bounty hunter. He wasn't even trying to make history. He was just a rancher, a man with a strong opinion about people, or things, stepping on his melons. One night, he hears a ruckus in the field, grabs his rifle, steps outside, and there it is. The creature. Big, red, exactly like the stories. Lumbering through the vines like it owns the place. Hastings doesn't wait. He raises his rifle and fires. The first shot hits. The beast staggers, but it doesn't fall, so he fires again. This time, the red ghost goes down. Dead. For real. Here's where it gets freaky. Hastings walks up to the body, and it's exactly what people had described for a decade. A camel, over 7 feet tall at the hump, covered in reddish, sun-bleached fur. Worn, weathered, but unmistakably a camel. And what's strapped to its back? A tangle of rotting leather harnesses. faded military gear, and twisted up inside that gear are human remains, bones, still attached, still tied in. A full skeleton, or what was left of one. A skull, a rib cage, a sun-bleached arm bone. No clothes, no identification. Just time-worn fragments of whoever this poor soul used to be. And that was it. That was the moment where legend and reality collided. Because it meant the stories, the ones everyone laughed off for years, were real. People didn't make it up. They didn't exaggerate. They saw what they said they saw. A camel, a corpse, and terror on four legs. So what happened next? Honestly, not much. The camel was buried, or burned, or left for scavengers, depending on which version of the story you read. The bones, gone. The saddle, decayed. No museum display. No plaque. No follow-up investigation. No government agent came out to ask questions. No historian showed up to collect evidence. No records were taken. It was just over. After that, the sighting stopped. The red ghost was dead, the desert went quiet again. And a decade-long frontier mystery ended in a melon patch. But let's take a second to appreciate that. This creature survived the wild for years. It endured deserts, drought, gunshots, fear, folklore. And it still managed to terrify an entire region, only to be taken down by a guy with a good aim and a low tolerance for crop damage. Mizzou Hastings didn't become famous, he didn't get a statue, he didn't get written into the textbooks, but he ended one of the strangest chapters in American folklore, and all he had to do was be a little bit fed up. But here's the twist. Even though the red ghost was gone, the story didn't spread. You'd think it would have been national news. Corpse camel killed in Arizona melon field. Front page, big letters, maybe even a dramatic sketch. Well, it got a few mentions in local papers, and then nothing. Why? Because people had already decided it was a myth, and when the truth showed up, when it turned out to be real, it didn't fit the narrative. It was too weird, too sad, too camel. So it got filed under frontier nonsense, forgotten, left to rot in the margins of history. The legend didn't just die with the camel, it died in silence. Let's talk about why that happened. Because honestly, this story has everything. A rogue military project, a skeleton-riding desert beast, a terrified public, a final showdown involving melons. This should be one of those wild chapters in every American history book, the kind you read in 5th grade and go, wait, what? But it's not. It's buried, literally and historically. And it wasn't just some oversight. It feels like someone wanted it forgotten. Let's unpack that. 1. The Jefferson Davis problem. Remember the guy who started the whole camel experiment? Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War in the 1850s, also the future president of the Confederacy. So after the Civil War, Davis went from innovative military strategist to let's never speak of him again. Any project with his name on it, especially one as bizarre as importing camels, was quietly shelved. No legacy, no lessons, no thank you tour. The US Army ghosted the camels. And the camels, well, they ghosted back. 2. The government doesn't love admitting mistakes, especially weird ones. Let's be fair. The camel experiment wasn't a total failure, but it was politically messy, culturally awkward, and it ended with skeletons turning up in places they definitely shouldn't have. So when one of those camels possibly killed a woman, terrorized a region, and wandered the Southwest like some undead parade float. Yeah, nobody was writing a press release about that. Even though it happened, even though people reported it, even though someone shot one dead and found bones tied to its back. It just didn't make it into the archives. Because the easiest way to erase a weird mistake, pretend it never happened. 3. Newspapers did their best, then moved on. To their credit, the local press covered the red ghost. Arizona newspapers ran articles, witnesses gave quotes. A few papers even published creepy illustrations. But the national press? Silence. Because this was pre-World War I, America. They were trying to look modern, tough, rational, serious, and a feral camel carrying human remains through the desert like some sunburned Grim Reaper. not the image they wanted to project. So the story got recategorized, not as fact but as folklore, a ghost tale, a regional oddity. And once that label stuck, it never came off. 4. American history is weirdly boring on purpose. You get the big wars, the big presidents, the economy, the Constitution, some maps. But the weird stuff? The accidents, the undead camels? Not so much. Because weird stories are hard to explain. You'd have to say things like, yes, the military imported camels. Yes, one might have killed someone. Yes, it had a skeleton tied to its back. No, we don't know why. That makes people uncomfortable. So instead we get the tidy version. The safe one. The one without corpse camels roaming Arizona. Which is a shame. Because this story isn't just fascinating. It's real. And pretending it didn't happen doesn't make it any less true. It just makes our understanding of history smaller. 5. Folklore survived where textbooks didn't. Despite the silence in the official records, the locals didn't forget. Old ranching families in Arizona still talk about the red ghost. Tour guides still mention it. And there's even a camel statue in quartzsite, honouring High Jolly, the Ottoman camel handler who trained the beasts. The memory lived on in stories, in cowboy tales, in the weird little display cases of local museums. It just never crossed over into mainstream history. Because unless someone famous dies, or there's a war, stories like this tend to fall through the cracks, which is exactly why we need to tell them now. Because, let's be real, this wasn't just a monster story. It was about government ambition, cultural weirdness, poor planning, and a terrifying, slow-burn mystery that spanned a decade and haunted an entire region. It was real. It was forgotten. So what do we do with all this? A dead woman, a skeleton, a forgotten military experiment, and a camel that somehow became a monster. This story should have been carved into the bones of American folklore. Instead, it got ghosted by its own government. But it stuck around because it's weird, because it's disturbing, because it's way too specific to be made up, and because deep down there's something about it that just hits. What made the red ghost terrifying? It wasn't just the size, or the bones, or the silence. It was the unpredictability. The feeling that something was out there, something that didn't follow the rules and didn't care that it didn't. This wasn't a wild animal. It wasn't a ghost, it was a glitch, a living contradiction. Proof that something had gone wrong and was still roaming the desert because no one had fixed it. And that's what scared people the most. The red ghost didn't hunt, it didn't roar, it didn't stalk its victims. It just was, moving through the world like a leftover problem. A question no one wanted to answer, a memory that never got closure. And it becomes more terrifying the longer we ignore it. Kind of like history itself. And this kind of history? It's messy. It's full of chaos. It's made up of strange decisions, wild ideas, and people trying something bold like importing camels, and then walking away when it backfires. The red ghost was the literal embodiment of that recklessness. A government plan no one followed up on. A life lost, maybe two, and a creature left behind to carry the burden. It also makes you wonder, how many other stories like this are out there? How many were real but got too weird to survive? The red ghost isn't an outlier. It's a pattern, a reminder that the fringe isn't always fantasy. Sometimes it's just unprocessed truth. And that's why we need stories like this. Not just because they're entertaining, though yes, undead camels are objectively hilarious, but because they show us what history actually looks like. It can be messy, unfinished, human. People made decisions. Those decisions had consequences. And those consequences didn't always go away just because the paperwork did. Sometimes they walked, sometimes they ran, sometimes they showed up in your melon patch with a skeleton on their back and demanded your attention. So yeah, maybe the red ghost isn't in the textbooks, but it's real. History isn't just what we remember, it's also what we choose to forget. And some stories, they refuse to stay buried. This was Deleted Histories, real stories nearly lost. See you in the next strange chapter.